Hello, I'm Janine Turner, founder of Constituting America. I and Kathy Gillespie, Constituting America's CEO, welcome you to our 13th annual academic study. 90 plus 90 equals 180. History holds the key to the future. We would like to thank Amanda Hughes for orchestrating all of these wonderful studies and all of our guest essayists. This year's study, the 13th study, is First Principles on the American Founding. Today is Essay 11 by Professor Knipprath. Principle of educating based on ethical, philosophical, self-evident truths of good government designed for a free people, recognized as important for acquiring civic virtue. The direct and essential connection among education, civic virtue, and good Republican government was a self-evident truth for many late 18th century American political and religious leaders. There was far less agreement, however, as to what exactly constituted virtue. To what extent, quote, the people were capable of exercising civic virtue, and if one could count on virtue to restrain political leaders, either because the leaders themselves would possess a sufficient measure or because the people would use theirs to keep the leaders in check. During the debates in 1787 and 1788 over the adoption of the new federal constitution, civic or public virtue was a frequent topic of discussion. To opponents of the proposed government, it was axiomatic that, however virtuous the people might be, they would not be able to control corrupt factional leaders in a faraway central government. Supporters, in turn, scaled heights of flattering rhetoric to extol the strength of Republican virtue among the American people. Virtues might be the coin of the realm for good government in the minds of American Republicans of the time, but there was no consensus about its proper alloy. To New Englanders, such as Adams, their Puritan heritage saw virtue as private frugality and sobriety, and public virtue in service and sacrifice for the common good. Moreover, public virtue necessarily arose from private virtue. Quote, public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics, end quote. John Adams wrote to the historian Mercy Otis Warren in April 1776. Moreover, Republican government was essential to, quote, true liberty, end quote. However, man, being fallen, lacked virtue by nature. Virtue had to be taught, but that was a difficult project. Education, though necessary, was not sufficient. Coercion must always be kept near at hand. As John Adams wrote to Thomas Jefferson in October 1787, quote, I have long been settled in my own opinion that neither philosophy nor religion, nor morality nor wisdom, nor interest will ever govern nations or parties against their vanity, their pride, their resentment or revenge, or their avarice or ambition. Nothing but force and power and strength can restrain them, end quote. It should be noted that Adams, like many others of the founding generation of American Republicans, distrusted pure democracy. In a letter in April 1814 to the Southern agrarian philosopher John Taylor of Carolina, he wrote, echoing classical political thought, quote, remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. It is in vain to say that democracy is less vain, less proud, less selfish, less ambitious, or less avarice than aristocracy or monarchy. It is not true, in fact, and nowhere appears in history. Those passions are the same in all men, under all forms of simple government, and when unchecked, produce the same effects of fraud, violence, and cruelty. End quote. There were limits to the degree to which all people could be trained to civic virtue, limits which inerred in man's corruption through the passions and in the frailty of the human mind to control them. For Southern agrarian Republicans, private virtue, even if successfully inculcated in the people, could not guarantee civic virtue in the halls of government. Adams' assertion, quote, public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics, end quote, might well be true as far as it went. However, as John Taylor of Caroline wrote, quote, by expecting public good from private virtue, we expose ourselves to public evils from private vices, end quote. The New England solution of using the strong hand of an intrusive government to control private vices was unpalatable to the Southern agrarian class. Instead, they agreed with James Madison in the Federalist Number 51 that there was a, quote, need for auxiliary precautions, end quote. Those auxiliary precautions included a structure of divided powers where, quote, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, end quote. Good Republican government could be fostered by relying not on the public virtue of either political leaders or a civically militant people, but on embracing the reality of conniving and power-hungry politicians whose mutual jealousies would check each other. In similar manner, political factions, that bane of good Republican government, being driven by self-interest, would jockey for influence in constantly changing coalitions. Among factions, none would become entrenched, as there were no permanent allies or enemies, only permanent interest, to borrow from Lord Palmerston's policy description of 19th century British international relations. National Republicans, such as Alexander Hamilton and George Washington, rejected a fundamental premise that underlay other conceptions of civic virtue. Rather than treat virtue and passions or self-interest as antithetical and fusing public virtue to private virtue, National Republicans simply redefined that relationship. Some private vices were rooted in self-interest, such as the desire for fame, honor, or even wealth, but they could be harnessed to produce great public benefit and therefore should be considered civic virtues. Government could create incentives for persons to engage in such, quote, good, end quote, passions to produce great public benefit. Nor were all members of the American elite without doubt about the scope of virtue among the American people or about their capacity to attain a sufficient measure of it. John Adams, a prolific writer on the connection between virtue and good Republican government, as lived at the time, warned in a letter in June 1776, quote, the only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue, and if this cannot be inspired into our people in a greater measure than they have it now, they may change their rulers and the forms of government, but they will not obtain a lasting liberty. They will only exchange tyrants and tyrannies, end quote. Whatever their differences about the meaning of virtue and about the capacity of private virtue to produce sufficient public virtue, the expositors of virtue politics generally agreed with Aristotle that education and training in private virtue were necessary to its practice. For most of them, only the broad distribution of land ownership rivaled virtue in promoting and protecting liberty and republican government. Thus, education to virtue was an essential task, even if the outcome was uncertain and incomplete. Education had to be grounded in religion and morality, as those were the sources of virtue. The Northwest Ordinance of 1787, perhaps the greatest peacetime achievement of the Confederation Congress, codified this premise, quote, religion, morality, and knowledge being necessary to good government and the happiness of mankind, schools, and the means of education shall forever be encouraged, end quote. President George Washington, in his lengthy farewell address published in September 1796, gave a succinct rhetorical overview of the connection among religion, morality, virtue, and good republican government. Quote, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of particular structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. It is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule, indeed, extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Promote, then, as an object of primary importance, institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge." End quote. There was cause for optimism, as the American population had a high rate of literacy compared to that even of European countries. Quote, "Ours are the only farmers who can read Homer," end quote, as self-satisfied Thomas Jefferson boasted in a letter to St. John de Crèvecoeur in January 1787. Jefferson is well known for his efforts in the founding of the University of Virginia in 1819, for the design of which he also developed architectural plans. His educational activism was not limited to creating a university. As early as 1785, in his Note on the State of Virginia, Jefferson laid out a plan to educate younger children of both sexes for 3 years at public expense, with higher grades open to the boys of parents who could afford the tuition and to a limited number of other boys selected on the basis of their intellectual capabilities. In Jefferson's somewhat indelicate language to modern ears, quote, "By this means 20 of the best geniuses will be raked from the rubbish annually and be instructed at the public expense so far as the grammar schools go," end quote. His ambitious plan was not realized in any form in Virginia until after the Civil War. Along with the general goals of imparting knowledge for its own sake and for practical pursuits, Jefferson saw education as a necessary process for Republican government. Perhaps his best-known aphorism regarding the importance of education appeared in a letter he wrote to Colonel Charles Yancey in January 1816. Quote, "If a nation expects to be ignorant and free in a state of civilization, it expects what never was and never will be," end quote. The antidote to such a doomed expectation was education. Quote, "The qualifications for self-government in society are not innate. They are the result of habit and long training," end quote. Jefferson wrote to Edward Everett in March 1824. Other famous Americans echoed these sentiments. As supposedly worldly and skeptical as he was, Benjamin Franklin nevertheless advised, quote, "A Bible and a newspaper in every house, a good school in every district, all studied and appreciated as they merit, are the principal support of virtue, morality, and civic liberty," end quote. James Madison declared that the Constitution required, quote, "sufficient virtue among men for self-government," end quote. Otherwise, quote, "nothing less than the chains of despotism can restrain them from destroying and devouring one another," end quote. The old son of liberty, Samuel Adams, opined in a letter to James Warren in 1779, quote, "If virtue and knowledge are diffused among the people, they will never be enslaved. This will be their great security," end quote. None of the founding generation appear as convinced of the importance of education and religion to virtue and of virtue to liberty preserved through Republican government as Samuel's cousin John Adams. Despite his occasional doubts and pessimism, Adams was a staunch virtue Republican. His writings are filled with quotable passages about the subject. A few will give the essence of his thoughts. Perhaps his best known, expressed in a letter in October 1798 to officers in the Massachusetts militia, is, quote, Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other, end quote. This sentiment embraced the then common belief that the American experiment in self-government, more than aristocratic or monarchic systems, relied on virtue widely diffused among the general population, or at least among those who would have the privilege to vote or to hold public office. In the same letter in 1776, in which Adams expressed concern about the state of virtue among his fellow Americans, "Statesmen, my dear sir, may plan and speculate for liberty, but it is religion and morality alone which can establish the principles upon which freedom can securely stand. The only foundation of a free constitution is pure virtue," end quote. To complete the causal chain, one may point to his 1765 dissertation on the canon and feudal law, where he asserted, quote, "Liberty cannot be preserved without general knowledge among the people," end quote. These quotations are not merely a string of disjointed musings. The writers put practical efforts behind their firm and constant beliefs shared by Americans generally. Jefferson's contributions to education have already been noted. Adams was the principal drafter of the historically important Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. That charter declared that, quote, "the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend upon piety, religion, and morality," end quote. Article 5 formally encouraged the development of publicly funded primary and grammar secondary schools. To justify that effort, this section began, quote, "Wisdom and knowledge, as well as virtue, diffused generally among the body of the people, are necessary for the preservation of their rights and liberties," end quote. Joerg W. Knipprath is an expert on constitutional law and a member of the Southwestern Law School faculty. Professor Knipprath has been interviewed by print and broadcast media on a number of related topics, ranging from recent U.S. Supreme Court decisions to presidential succession. He has written opinion pieces and articles on business and securities law, as well as constitutional issues, and has focused his more recent research on the effect of judicial review on the evolution of constitutional law. He has also spoken on business law and contemporary constitutional issues before professional and community forums and serves as a Constituting America Fellow. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us for Essay 11, and join us tomorrow for Essay 12. Please spread the word in every forum about this wonderful academic study this year, because what's more important than America's founding virtues and principles? Also, don't forget to check out last year's study on American exceptionalism, exposed, defined, revealed, explained, because when you say America is exceptional, if you do, and someone else says, no, it's not, if they do, if you read last year's study, you will be fortified with all kinds of definitive proof of why we are exceptional. Have a wonderful day. We'll be back here tomorrow with Essay 12.